Hi, I'm David, and I'm a doctoral candidate in cultural anthropology here at UC San Diego. And I wanted to talk today about what I'm calling the disenchantment of morality. And if you've been following my channel, you know that I'm putting up these videos, I talk extemporaneously. And part of the purpose may be to talk to an audience, but part of the purpose is for me to exteriorize, to put out there some things that just have been ruminating in my head, in particular with regard to my experience as a whistleblower here at UC San Diego and the psychological trauma and shock that accompanied that. And so, me putting out these videos is my way of working through some of those issues and trying to understand exactly what happened. Why was it the case that moral and legal norms and rules were so flagrantly broken? How did people justify that? And why am I different? And why did I respond differently than these other folks? And in previous videos, I talked about how the university came to be dominated by people variously with either racial animus or cowardice in response to the racial animus or simple careerism. Um, so this is going to be a little bit different. I am going to talk about kind of the history of morality and the movement from the medieval world into the modern world, and what the philosopher Charles Taylor has called disenchantment as something that's happened in terms of the way that people relate to what they encounter in the world and how they understand themselves and become selves. And then I'm going to try to relate that to what happened in the department. I think that a great deal of what happened at the university and here at UC San Diego and also at universities across the United States that have engaged in widespread conspiracies to violate civil rights laws can be explained in part by understanding how the morality of these individuals and institutions has become disenchanted. And so I think that concept has a great deal of explanatory power. Okay, so what is meant by disenchantment? I'm going to approach this in two different ways. One of the ways is the way that I understand Charles Taylor to have approached it, and the other is going to be a little more intuitive. So I'm going to approach the intuitive part first because I think that might grab people a little more. So, what does it mean to be enchanted? So, kind of think about like in your own life when you've been enchanted, and what did that feel like? So, for example, I remember being enchanted by films. There was a film that I saw. The one that's coming to mind immediately is My Fair Lady, and there was a scene in it where Eliza Doolittle, the protagonist, sings "All I Want Is a Room Somewhere," and it deeply resonated with me. And I didn't break apart the scene into component pieces. I didn't perceive that I really comprehended or understood the scene. That's June behind me. That's my cat. I really felt that the filmmakers and the composers, the person who sang the song, which wasn't the actress actually, it was another person, were engaged in something that was really above me, something that I didn't really understand, something that was beyond my skill level. Right? This was something that I was sort of in awe of. I think awe and enchantment are very close to each other. You could think about if you've ever gone to a place where you've seen a great vista and you felt very small in relation to this vista, and you felt like there was something that was millions of years old here. I think some people feel that at the Grand Canyon. Or perhaps you've seen this beautiful sunset and you're just in awe of this sunset, right? This is something that you didn't anticipate, and now you're there, and you feel small. You feel like there is something about this that exceeds you, right? A deeper beauty that is beyond your comprehension, and that you are privileged to witness um, a deep meaning that is beyond your comprehension, and that you are privileged to witness, right? Um, and so I think that's a great idea of enchantment. And kind of the quintessential, or one of the quintessential moments of disenchantment would be in The Wizard of Oz, right? Where Dorothy and her companions go, and they are blown away by this visual, this spectacle of the wizard. But then it turns out actually it's just this little man behind the doorway manipulating his little screen in order to fool the masses. So if enchantment means feeling small, not in a bad way, but feeling overawed by this larger thing that we cannot understand, disenchantment is the movement from that into either the perception or the actuality that actually I've got this thing figured out. And in that, there is a movement of the self. It's not just an increase in knowledge or just a change in knowledge. There's a movement towards um, a different stance toward the thing, whether it is the thing to which we are enchanted or the thing to which we've got figured out, right? You could be enchanted by a watch, and like, how does this watch work, right? You can imagine people a couple hundred years ago looking at a watch and being amazed at how well this thing kept time. And then you open the watch cover and you see all the little gears and sprockets, and maybe you still don't understand it. Maybe you're still enchanted, right? And then over time, you come to understand how this thing works. And rather than experiencing enchantment, you simply come to experience the mechanism of the watch as a set of mechanisms. So there's an affective, there's a dispositional, experiential part of enchantment. Enchantment is bound up with our experience in the world, our being in the world, our movement in the world, and likewise, so is disenchantment. So that's the first way I wanted to approach enchantment or disenchantment. Now I'll talk about kind of Taylor and sort of how this is situated historically. So Taylor talks about the medieval ages as being characterized by enchantment. So if you're a medieval peasant and you wake up in the morning, you understand the sun to rise because God made the sun rise. And you understand the planets to move because God made the planets to move. Right? At a certain point, there weren't even mathematical formula to predict where the planets were going to be. Right? So this was seen as something that was something beyond human beings' comprehension to predict or understand. And in fact, it was at the time. And so God was responsible for the movement of the planets. God was responsible for the movement of the stars. God was responsible for the weather and all the different forms of life, right? All the varieties of life. And it would have been impossible to wake up as a peasant and think, well, actually, I don't believe in God anymore, because that would involve a complete change in absolutely everything else that you thought. Suddenly there would be no understanding of why anything happened, if that makes any sense. There were no alternate explanations. God was responsible for all these things. And people had practical schemas for how to plant crops and sort of, what to expect next. But there was no alternate philosophy to explain what we now call the phenomena of the natural world. There was no alternate philosophy to explain experience at a grand level, other than the fact that God was the one who created all these things. And so disenchantment is a movement towards that, towards naturalism, towards understanding that all the phenomena that exist are related to each other by a set of deterministic laws that relate phenomena one to another, right? So the planets come to be understood as following trajectories in the sky that can be predicted by the laws of planetary motion, which are equations for ellipses. And then in turn, those are explained by the laws of universal gravitation. So again, you're bringing something out of enchantment and into disenchantment, and a mechanistic understanding of how these things are related to each other, right? The movement of the planets. Likewise, with Darwin and Wallace, and then later with Mendel, and then the synthetic theory of evolution, and then Watson and Crick and genomics, you move from an understanding that life is variegated and held up through God's creative power, an enchanted understanding of the world, towards a disenchanted understanding of the world, right? Actually, all these forms of life exist because of progressive and successive adaptations descent through modification by natural selection, and that those principles and like principles are what result in speciation and adaptation. And then it continues into psychology, and you have behaviorism, where action is seen as occurring in response to habituated processes of reinforcement of behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. And obviously, there are limits. There seem to be limits to there seem to be limits to a science which understands all phenomena as all macro scale phenomena as explainable by breaking them into components and then determining how the components relate to each other through natural law. There are things. There's philosophies of emergence, right? There's my cats come up here, which talks about phenomena becoming what they are because of sort of new forms of being emerging at higher levels of order, which then influence things lower down. There's chaos theory, which challenges the idea that the world is as ordered as kind of a purely reductive mechanistic understanding of the world would presuppose it to be. But nevertheless, these are more theories which tie into an affective sense that, well, the world is figure outable. We may need to move beyond sort of a reductive mechanistic understanding of all phenomena to include things like emergence and to include things like chaos and chaotic systems and things of this nature. But nevertheless, it is possible to figure these things out. This is something within our capacity to do as individuals. And in so doing, when we enter into a process of thinking characterized by disenchantment, characterized precisely by this stance that the world in which we live is figure outable, that in turn, sort of in a dialectic sense, right, creates a particular kind of self that believes that the world is figure outable, right? Because self and world do not exist independently, they co-create each other. And so a movement from enchantment towards disenchantment involves a movement of a self from standing in awe of the world or parts of the world or particular experiences, and perceiving that those parts of the world or particular experiences or beings are above and beyond oneself, and toward a movement that actually, in fact, what is perceived is fundamentally figure outable, and I can kind of exist beyond it and above it and outside it and train my intellectual capacities on it and figure this thing out, or at least participate in a process of figuring this thing out over time. So what does this have to do with morality? Well, so Taylor talks about enchantment in particular with respect to the natural world, but we can think about this thing in terms of morality as well. So if you are a medieval peasant, just like you believe that the planets are set in motion by God and upheld by God, and all the variegated forms of life are created by God and upheld by God, you likewise believe that moral rules are instituted by God, that God is the lawgiver. So you believe that it's wrong to steal, right? It's wrong to covet your neighbor's wife, the Ten Commandments, right? It's wrong to not keep the Sabbath day holy. You have to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, right? You believe that all these commandments, these moral commandments, are true because God gave them. And in fact, these commandments are above you, and it's your job to order yourself in alignment with these commandments, to order your practices in the world in alignment with these commandments, precisely because God gave them. And God is greater, infinitely greater than you are, and God's commands are infinitely greater than you are, and therefore you must order yourself in alignment with these commands. So it would be sinful to order your life in such a way that you habitually steal. You must put, or habitually are dishonest. You must put in practice your life habituated honesty, right? Habituated fair dealing. So as human beings within the West, and then eventually all over, move towards an enchanted understanding of the natural world, towards a disenchanted understanding of the natural world, and actually a better way of saying it is move from an enchanted way of understanding experience to a disenchanted way of understanding experience. And part of the way of disenchanting experience is to put in place this thing called naturalism. Likewise, people go out and search for and implement ways to disenchant morality. So morality is no longer something which is given by God. Now morality is something which can be fit in to other phenomena and understood in relation to those other phenomena by deterministic relationships or natural laws. So one way of trying to understand morality that's been tried is to understand morality as emerging from social relationships and material relationships, right? So Marx makes the claim that morality is a set of rules or practices or ideology, so we get this idea of ideology at the same time, that legitimates class difference. So morality is no longer given by God. Now morality is something which is used to perpetuate class difference and to continue capitalist accumulation for the bourgeoisie and to perpetrate continued exploitation of the proletariat. And that's put in place by that fundamental idea is put into place by by Marx. Later on, Nietzsche probably is the person who maybe does more even than Marx to try to disenchant morality. Nietzsche essentially claims that the vast majority, if not all, of human beings, he's not exactly clear on that, are not moral, and that morality is simply one more way of human beings trying to do what's easy. So these moral rules are arbitrary. However, they're put in place. Marx has a very particular idea of how they're put in place. Nietzsche, Marx has a meta theory for how they're put in place. Their purpose is, or a teleological understanding of how they're put in place. They're put in place for the purpose of perpetuating class difference. Nietzsche's less interested in or what he would, I think, would characterize as a reductive understanding of morality, and instead is interested in a genealogical understanding of morality. In other words, you can trace how morality is put into place by looking at historical contingencies over time. So just like you could um, come to understand how a particular breed of dog is created by looking at its genealogy, maybe not looking at evolution, but just sort of taking a look at its genealogy, you could do the same thing with morality. And you could find a variety of different ways why morality came into being, and the class struggle might be one of them. But the overall point is that it's morality does not constitute a set of binding moral rules given by a lawgiver. These are inherently social and psychological processes whose origin can be understood by looking at their historical development. And then Foucault comes along and makes the claim that, very similar to Marx, that morality is essentially simply one manifestation of power. Foucault presents for his readers through his really complicated prose the idea that actually he's doing a lot of nuanced analysis, and in some ways he does do a nuanced analysis, but in other ways he's actually extraordinarily reductive. And the reductionism is that pretty much everything is just a manifestation of power. everything is a manifestation of power, and he doesn't really theorize power at all. But morality is one of these things. Morality is simply one more way of allocating and distributing power. So you have this denaturalization of morality, disenchantment of morality, by essentially linking morality to other social processes, whether that's the class struggle, whether it's a little less teleological and more genealogical with Nietzsche, whether it's reducing morality to power, which is what you see in Foucault. All of these things have in common this disenchantment of morality, which, as I've described before, really has these two main components. One is that you've situated the thing that you're addressing. So you've taken some form of experience, you brought it down into an object. You've separated yourself from this object, and then you've related the characteristics of that object to other things, much as you would do in the process of science when looking at natural phenomena. And along with that, you have this movement in an affective way from a perception of awe, from a perception that this thing is larger than you, from the perception that you might owe something to this larger thing, whether that's your awe or your humility or your reverence or your ordering of yourself to this thing. And now you come to perceive actually this thing is sort of a set of object phenomena that are separate from me and fundamentally figure outable, and in some ways sort of beneath me. I can figure them out. Maybe they can't figure me out, but I can figure them out, if that makes sense. So you have one strand of disenchantment with respect to morality, which is situating morality within other social phenomena, and then explaining those things, the morality, in terms of those other social phenomena through somewhat deterministic relationships, or teleological relationships, or genealogical relationships. The second way that morality is disenchanted is to actually situate it more explicitly within natural science, in particular evolutionary theory. So in this flavor of disenchantment, morality is understood as epiphenomenal to or consequent to evolution, right? So you can find under this sort of set of theories, or this form of disenchantment, you can find the origin of morality essentially within primatology, right? You can find it by taking a look at how primate behavior emerges in response to evolutionary forces. So, for example, a real problem of primatology is altruism, right? altruism isn't a problem if you have an enchanted idea of morality, because God mandates altruism, and therefore you are altruistic because God mandates it. But if your prior conception is that morality emerges from evolution, which is understood to be inherently a selfish process, um, selfish in the sense that um, those behaviors should be rewarded, which perpetuate one's own fitness rather than other people's fitness, which is to say one's ability to reproduce. It's not exactly clear where altruism would come from or why it should exist. And so you have theories that then attempt to explain altruism in terms of the a priori theories that are taken to be true, namely the synthetic theory of evolution. So, for example, there's a famous saying by an evolutionary biologist in response to somebody who asked him, "Would you die for somebody?" Right? And he said, "Yeah, I would die for 2 of my siblings or 8 of my cousins." Right? Because 2 of your siblings have the equivalent of your genome, and the same thing for 8 of your cousins, right? And so that's an endorsement of a theory which holds that um, provided that one's self-sacrifice is such that um, one's total genome is likely to be passed on, that sacrifice would then result in the genes that would create that kind of behavior could be passed on, precisely because even if an individual had those genes died, they would be serving to perpetuate the genes per se, because they're actually in other people, if that makes any sense. And there are a variety of flavors or variations upon that theme within theory that tries to explain morality through evolution. But that strain, right, the strain of trying to understand morality through evolution, shares in common those strains which try to understand morality through their relationships to other social phenomena, such as the one, Marx, Nietzsche, Foucault, that one can understand morality primarily in terms of its relationship to other phenomena, and that in turn, morality is to a certain extent figure outable. We can figure it out. And so you have the concurrent disenchantment of the natural world, what we call the natural world now, right? The planets, the movement of the planets, forms of life, along with the disenchantment of morality. And so if you follow me so far, we're now at a place where we can start to think about, well, what are the impacts of a disenchanted morality on actual human behavior at the university? Okay, so I want to move away from theory because I realize I just theory dumped on you. And I want to talk about my personal experience and how I came to understand and have the moral worldview that I do. So, and this is going to be really attenuated because my brain is going to be wiped out if I try to give you my full personal history. But the short bit of it is I grew up Christian evangelical in Eastern Washington State and rejected the more dogmatic forms of Christian evangelicalism, in particular theories that the earth is only 6,000 years old. That was something that really bothered me when I was young, and I rejected that, and I still reject it. I don't think that's the case. I think that God created the world through a variety of processes, but either the world is a lot more than 6,000 years old, or God specifically engineered the world to try to get us, to try to fool us, which sounds to me implausible. That doesn't really sound like the God that I know. The God I know doesn't play tricks like that. And briefly became agnostic, and then reconverted to Christianity when I was 32 or 33, I forget, but about 10 years ago. And even when I was agnostic, I had a disenchanted view of morality. I've never held to, or sorry, an enchanted view of morality. I've never held to a disenchanted view of morality. I was raised up to believe that morality was enchanted. When I became agnostic, I nevertheless held on to this idea that there really was right and wrong in a deep metaphysical sense. That right and wrong could manifest themselves in historical ways, but it was something which transcended history. It was always wrong to rape. It's not just, I'm not just socially conditioned to believe that rape is wrong. I think I legitimately know it to be wrong. And I think that if I were brainwashed, or somebody else, I should say, I don't think this would be possible for me, but I think if somebody else were brainwashed into believing that rape was right, that person would be wrong in a deep metaphysical sense. But when I left Christianity and became agnostic, how exactly morality was wrong in a metaphysical sense, or put in another way, how it was possible for me to continue with an enchanted understanding of morality became a real problem. And it concerned me a great deal. And shortly after I became agnostic, probably about 5 years after, so I became agnostic when I was 17. When I was 23, I discovered the work of the Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky. And his thought and his art has left a lasting impression on my life and continues to be one of the fundamentals for, I would say, my religious faith is the fundamental, but Dostoevsky is very much involved, and causal, and definitely co-causal to why I both believe and order my life to reflect what I think is the deep metaphysical truth that morality is transcendental, and not immanent, that it is beyond the natural world. So who's Dostoevsky? Well, Dostoevsky was a 19th century Russian novelist. He was a Slavophile. He was a Russia lover. So he was deeply patriotic. There's some problems with that in his writing. You don't have to agree with everything that Dostoevsky says. It's also worth pointing out he was an anti-Semite, not in a virulent way. He was a Russian. He was a non-Jew. He was a Gentile Russian in the 19th century, and anti-Semitism was sort of in the air that they breathed, and so it ended up in his novels in little ways, not in ways that really fundamentally altered what the novels said or did. He was not race obsessed. But anyway, so he wrote from his major works span from the 1840s to the early 1860s or the 1870s, and Dostoevsky is writing in a milieu of rapid secularization and westernization of Russia. And so he's living in an age when Russia, another way of saying it, is being disenchanted. I don't think I've ever heard or read somebody who's a Dostoevsky scholar use that word, but I think that's an appropriate way of saying it. So Russia, which had been a deeply Eastern Orthodox country, was experiencing the intrusion or the movement of atheistic philosophy from Western Europe. People like Fourier, for example, like the Russian, the French futurist. Futurist isn't a wrong word, but atheists. Bakunin was a Russian atheist that heavily influenced Dostoevsky, and these writers who were writing in the wake of Marx and his ideas are essentially making the claim that human beings can remake morality to be better and to create a utopia. So if the previous morality, the bourgeoisie morality, existed in order to perpetuate the class struggle and keep the proletariat um, dominated by the bourgeoisie for the purposes of capital accumulation, it was necessary to dispense with the old morality and put in place a new morality um, that could then be used to create the human utopia. The French Revolution is also sitting in the background on all this, and I'm just going to gesture to that because again, it's already at 35 minutes. But there's a huge connection between the replacement of the French aristocracy with the French Republic and the Napoleonic Wars, and the secularization of France, and these utopian French writers. So Dostoevsky has this question of how do you maintain morality, or what is morality, or is there morality when there is no God? This is the key question, along with the theodistic question, the theodicy question of how can there be a loving God in the midst of a world of extreme evil? Those are kind of the two questions that Dostoevsky will write toward in all of his great novels. How do you have morality, or can you have morality without God? I won't bury the lead. His answer is no. That's the first question. And the second question, the one that he struggles with and never arrives at a definitive answer for, is how can you have a loving God in a world of extreme evil? And the addressing of these two questions, these two twinned questions, come together in his greatest novel, The Brothers Karamazov, which you should read. Everybody should read it. You can't understand the West without The Brothers Karamazov. It's essential reading. But I didn't read it first. The first book that I read was Crime and Punishment. And in Crime and Punishment, I was thinking, should I tell you a little bit about Dostoevsky's biography, because it's pretty important. Dostoevsky, when he was young, went in on these theories. He endorsed these theories. He was part of a revolutionary cadre that was found out by the Tsars and Tsar's security services. He was subject to a mock execution. He was sent to Siberia. And while he was there, he was radically transformed as an individual. And he came to believe that people don't do evil because of social conditions. They do evil because they choose evil by choice. And he made that determination by seeing these prisoners, and on the basis of his own experience, coming to the conclusion that these prisoners who were evil did so because they chose evil, and those prisoners who chose goodness and chose redemption did so of their own free will. And if that's the case, then the idea that you can create a human utopia by just rewriting the moral order completely falls apart. And by extension, it causes you to call into question the critique of the new utopians, or the utopians such as Fourier, that in fact the old morality was nothing more than the perpetuation of oppression in one form or another. I can get more into that, but we're already at 38 minutes, and I don't want to belabor the point too much. But the point is that Dostoevsky's critiques weren't merely intellectual; they emerged out of his own biography in a really powerful way. So Dostoevsky is writing, again, in the context of disenchantment within Russia, the secularization of Russia, and the movement into Russia of these atheistic utopian philosophies, principally from France. 1 second. And he wrote against these philosophies through fiction, but a fiction that was heavily informed by actual events that really took place. So he didn't just invent them out of his own head. He actually went and he found these examples that became case studies, expanded into art, into literature, into narrative, which then act as a powerful critique of these new atheistic philosophies that are coming into Russia. And his first novel, and probably his most famous novel, though probably not his greatest novel, is Crime and Punishment. And in Crime and Punishment, you have this character who's a poor university student who's living in St. Petersburg, buys into these theories that human beings can create their own morality, right? These theories of disenchanted morality, decides that he is going to be a Napoleon-like figure. Again, come back to the French Revolution, right? And he is going to kill a pawnbroker who he perceives as having no moral worth, take her money, and then do some kind of good with it. What kind of good is always sort of unspecified. And he carries out the murder. He ends up having to kill another person who comes along, which is a powerful argument for the problem of creating your own moralities. You don't know what the consequences are going to be, right? If you try to create your own morality on the basis of consequentialism, you don't really know what the future consequences are going to be. And the rest of the novel, after the murder, follows his moral and psychological disintegration, because he has, from the perspective of Dostoevsky, sinned against God, sinned against the earth itself, which is representative of God, the Russian soil, and sinned against Russia also, right? The soil is both representative of God's creation, but also of Russia itself. And the immoral figure of this university student called Raskolnikov is, in the novel, contrasted with the moral protagonist of Sonia, who is in many ways Raskolnikov's opposite, and someone who is intellectually very simple, but in her faith and her moral conviction very strong. And what Dostoevsky shows is, when you take God out of the picture, you take away any kind of incentive to actually behave morally. A famous saying of Dostoevsky is, without God, everything is permitted. And that's a profound statement. Right? Without God, everything is permitted. What exactly would be prohibited? And why? If there is no God? What? On what basis? If morality is merely disenchanted, if it's simply one phenomenon or set of phenomena among many, if it's related deterministically to other phenomena, then the only limits upon morality are those limits specified by the deterministic relationship that morality has with those other phenomena. And as we've seen, in a purely observational sense, there aren't any limits on that. The Nazis fully believed that they were moral when they set up an industrial system to exterminate the Jews. And this is something that Dostoevsky predicts. Dostoevsky predicts, in another book, The Demons, the Russian Revolution. He predicts the emergence of individuals who will claim that it's moral to kill millions of people in order to set up what they perceive as a perfectly just moral order. And at the time that I started reading Dostoevsky at 23, up until now, 19 years later, I am fully convinced by his arguments, at least with respect to morality. I do think that he's right, that without God, everything is permitted. Which is something that I think a lot of people haven't given full thought to. And later I reconverted to Christianity. But in fact, my reconversion was in many sense an intellectual process. It's like, well, do I think everything is permitted? No. Deeply, I don't. Now, is that because of my socialization and my early upbringing in evangelicalism? If I were to adopt a deterministic understanding of my own evolution as a self, maybe, but I also reject that. I think I have free will. And I've also experienced love, and I think that's real. And I don't think that can just be reduced down to evolutionary phenomena or social phenomena either. I think it's deeper than that. I think love is deeper than the immanent phenomena that can be explained deterministically, and I think the same is true about morality. I've seen awful things in my life, experienced awful things, things that wrench the moral fabric. I think they're evil. I've experienced great goodness, great love. I think they really are good. I know they're good, which means there's something out there that's bigger than me, that properly speaking should enchant me. I should be enchanted by the good, and I should want to align myself with it. And when I don't, there's something wrong. Okay, so let's talk about where things have gone wrong at the university. Because there's a lot of evil here. There's a lot of evil. So I started taking classes here in 2018, and morality was framed in a way that was entirely disenchanted. There was no opening for morality to be anything other than disenchanted. We read Foucault, we read Marx. I don't think I was ever assigned Nietzsche, but it was in the background. Read Gramsci. All people for whom morality is disenchanted. Read the decolonialists, the post-colonialists. Read Fanon, Frantz Fanon, who is a founding figure in decolonial anthropology. Fanon is a moral monster. Fanon explicitly justifies genocide in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, and the cultural genocide of indigenous peoples. Nobody seemed to have a problem with that. But all the time, as I was going through the hallways at UCSD and reading people that had advocated for disenchanted morality, and in many cases advocating for things that were totally and completely immoral according to the standards of morality that I was raised with, like genocide with Fanon, right? Or the violent wiping out of the bourgeoisie by Marx. I nevertheless believed that I was having relationships with professors and other graduate students who in some ways were enchanted by morality like me. I thought that. I thought, oh, well, these people are just playing with this stuff. When it comes down to it, they do the right thing. They think that morality is sort of real, and that they, not real in a sense that it's just a social representation, but real in a deeper sense, and that they're going to align their actions with it. They wouldn't really do anything grossly immoral. That's what I thought. And then I witnessed gross professional violations of boundaries, clear abuses of power, acts that were totally and completely illegal, not even a little bit legal, totally and completely illegal, racist. And when I called people on the illegal racist actions, they lied to me. They lied directly to my face. I was told, I don't know if it's illegal. I don't think it's illegal. There were emails. There were meeting minutes. there was an accreditation report which clearly showed this illegal, immoral behavior. And then these people lied to me about it. And it was a psychological shock. when that happened. The psychological shock, I think, and I've experienced this a couple times in my life, I would say at least 3 or 4 times, um, I think occurs when two conditions are met. The first is that your being, including your schemas for understanding your sense data, are incapable of making sense of that data. You simply can't fit it into an explanatory framework. Your schemas could not predict that this behavior was a possibility, and or the sense data would occur, and once it occurs, you have no idea what to do with it. And the second point is the second thing that conjoins along with that that inability to make sense of what you're experiencing is deep psychological distress. So if you have the first but not the second, it could actually be very funny, right? We've always seen like comedies where somebody acts in a way that's absolutely absurd and ridiculous, and you would never anticipate somebody doing that. Maybe they violate a gross social norm, but you're in the audience and you're watching it and you laugh. Like one of the consequences of running into something that you never be able to anticipate is humor. But it's when that experience of being unable to fit the particular experience into one's prior schemas or ways of being in the world coexists with a sense of deep psychological distress that creates psychological shock and trauma. So I experienced psychological shock when one of my best friends was killed in a forest fire. Like, again, never in a million years thought it would happen, right? And then it happens, you have no idea what to do with it. And then there's a deep psychological distress. Had that happen in other experiences in my life. That's what happened, here in the university. It's like, how could these people do this? And they all did it. That's the crazy thing. It's like, that's part of the shock, right? I think part of my mental scheme was that some people could break the law, but not everybody. Not everybody. And then not the people above them, then not the whole institution. And then it turns out actually everybody participated through acts of commission or omission. The whole institution was part of it. And the last couple of years, I've been in this process of coming to accept that the morality of the university is a deeply, maybe completely disenchanted morality. The people here really don't believe that morality is in any way transcendent. They don't believe that it's their job to figure themselves out and then order themselves to be in alignment with morality. They actually believe that morality itself is something they can figure out. And they don't need to order themselves to it. They're free to order morality as they see fit. That's the form of self that has come into being for them in response to their free will choice to relate to morality as if it were disenchanted. And it's been difficult for me to come to that form of acceptance because it means accepting a lot of other stuff. It means that I'm associating with people that really don't perceive that there are limits on their behavior. One of the things that, or I should say, the only limits on their behavior are deterministic relations and social relations, not internal relations of free will and choice. So I really do think these people are capable of committing genocide. I do think the professors in my department are capable of committing genocide. You put them in the right social conditions, they would do it. They would do it in a heartbeat. They would do it because that's the philosophy they've endorsed. They've disenchanted morality. They think it's something they can figure out and manipulate. That it's a tool for their use. So for them, everything is permitted. Why wouldn't it be? They already blatantly broke the law, engaged in pervasive dishonesty, racism, objectification, abuses of power, endorsed philosophies and philosophers that in turn endorse genocide. They absolutely would do it. Nietzsche was wrong that morality is purely genealogical. But I've reluctantly come to believe that he was right, that most people aren't moral. Most people, when they do something that is outwardly moral, are doing what is outwardly moral because they exist within a social milieu where doing what is outwardly moral is rewarded. And it's the easy thing. When you require people to sacrifice for their beliefs, out of the sense that it's their duty to order themselves to morality, most people don't sacrifice. Most people engage in post facto justification, which is exactly what happened in my department. What was most interesting was a conversation I had with a professor that was part of the illegality. And I pressed her on this. I really pressed her on it. And I said, what you did was wrong. It was illegal. You shouldn't have done it. And it was remarkable that I didn't get some kind of complicated theoretical explanation of why I was right. I was told, essentially, we were going to do this. This is what we wanted to do. That's what you get with the disenchanted morality. You can get an outward veneer of Foucauldian or Marxian or Nietzschean justifications and philosophy, but it's a smokescreen. It's just a tool for those folks. At the heart, it really is about power. They've bought in to the deep idea that the world is nothing more than a set of people engaged in a power struggle or groups engaged in a power struggle, and they're engaged in a power struggle, and they're going to do what they have to do. And the morality is, for them, just one more manifestation of power, that they can be right if they've got the power to do it. When people endorse a disenchanted morality, I think you got to believe them. And it's shocking. It's really shocking, because what it means is I can no longer count on people at the university to treat me in a moral way, because it is moral. Their treatment of me will be abjectly immoral when it is in their interest to do it so, to treat me immorally, when they perceive that they can get away with it and that's what they want to do. And that's a little terrifying if you're a graduate student and you're in the lowest position of social power. Which is why I think a lot of people keep their mouth shut. So I feel like I should make an argument for why morality ought to be enchanted. I think I already did on the basis of consequence. But, the truth is that life is going to ask you, and already has, what do you believe about morality? And you are going to answer that question with the way you live your life. So think about, what is the answer that I'm giving? Okay, that's it for the day. Thanks for listening for an hour.